Hi, my name is Marissa Browne, and I'm going to start our presentation on the Triquetra of English learners. We'll focus on assets and complications in the student, caregiver, and teacher relationship. To start, we want to talk about the reality of English learners. And this reality is that there are English learners in your classroom. We can see on this map of the United States that the darker blue states have the highest percentages of English learners. But on average across the country, 15% of public school students in cities are English learners. And while that population continues to grow, the achievement gap has seen little improvement. And this is a problem because as teachers, we're committed to providing education for all of our learners, not just native English speakers. And we know that multilingualism has benefits for everyone, especially with a globalizing world. And so what we need to do to start with is do a little myth busting with our English learners. And so we have some fact or fiction questions for you. So if you read through these, you can see some common thoughts and perhaps myths about English learners. And it turns out that they're fiction. In reality, English learners don't measure up to any of these stereotypes, even though you might hear these in your schools or perhaps read them in literature. So what we hope to do, our purpose with this presentation is not only to bust those myths, but also outline the major obstacles that are currently facing students, teachers, and caregivers involved in educating English learners. We want to teach you mindset interventions that can help your English learners and also offer some practical solutions and pedagogical solutions for your teaching. To start with our framework, we're using this symbol. It's called a triquetra. This is the symbol that we're using to represent the student, teacher, and caregiver framework. But we derive this symbol from two more classic frameworks in the literature. One of those is the ecological model. You can see that here. And what this essentially says is that there are many layers of systems that affect an individual. So if you look at the little green individual in the middle, that's your student. But around that is the microsystem, so the teacher, the family, the caregivers, etc. The mesosystem, so that includes the whole school system, the neighborhood, their jobs, and then the exosystem and the macrosystem. Those systems are culture, race, ideologies, media, maybe even the whole national school system and policies. All of those things are in the exosystem, macrosystem. And another framework we want to keep in mind is this one here, the integrative model by Garcia Cole. And you should think of this as an add-on to the ecological model. Essentially, what this is saying is that for minority students in particular, things like racism, prejudice, discrimination, and oppression are often left out of the ecological model. And that's a problem because they influence the child in so many different ways. So we want to use both of these models, but also give you teachers a more simple symbol to keep in mind. And that's this, the triquetra, which we would call a relational framework. So we envision the 3 points as the students, the caregivers, and the teachers. Their relationship, you can see they're knotted together. They're all integrated. And then this green ring around the middle are the external factors. So that would be all of those things in the exosystem and the mesosystem. So culture, institutions, race, discrimination, all of those things. And all of those things are integrated within these relationships between student, caregiver, and teacher to all affect your English learners.
Now that we've established our framework, let's use that framework to consider the current shortcomings of EL education. The triquetra helps us to acknowledge that any obstacle for a student, caregiver, or teacher in this education process affects the other relationships in the triquetra. Now, we want to discuss the current obstacles in English language learner education, not to place blame or foster negativity, but to face what needs to change in order to improve educational experiences for English learners. In our project, we relied on a qualitative study focused on Mexican American English language learners. This study resulted in the graphic that you see on the screen, which links several of the major obstacles that students face as found in the paper's research. Now, let's link the obstacles from the paper to what we see in the Triquetra. And here we can see that, for example, communication gaps are something that affect everyone. So we can think about that as kind of really relying in the middle of our Triquetra. Lack of teacher preparation is something that is very much centered in the teacher. But when we look at the Triquetra, it affects the other relationships as well. Similar to communication gaps, a lack of a systemic articulated district EL plan or school-wide EL plan is again in the center, as that really does affect every single relationship and has something to do with the social culture or cultural aspects of the school. Again, this paper talks about a lack of support, and that goes more toward thinking about the caregiver. The paper talks more broadly as the families as well. And then finally, the low academic achievement that we often see for Hispanic ELL students is something that is very much student-centered. But again, if we look at it in the context of our Triquetra, it is something that is then intertwined with the other two aspects of our Triquetra as well. So what we want to talk about next is the communication gap. And we're going to focus in on the relationships that we have in the Triquetra. For the communication gap in between teachers and students, this means a lack of communication both ways, both due to language and culture, and therefore missing an opportunity for both learning and support in various ways. For the teacher-caregiver relationship, this communication gap means an inability to really lean into our belief that the parent or the caregiver is the first teacher of the student. The teacher may fail to create a working relationship with the parent because of the communication gap, and parents may not be able to share their culture, traditions, hopes, and dreams for their child in the way that they would like to because of this communication gap. And finally, the caregiver-student communication gap often results in an inability for the caregiver to really help the student with learning tasks that happen at home. This is really, really important to think about whenever you're assigning homework or projects, that if you have an EL in your class, you may not be able to expect necessarily the same support or relationship that you maybe expect of your other students. And finally, we also need to talk about systemic obstacles. So as a student goes through a school, this paper found that teachers often have different responses or approaches to EL students each year. And so that can create a lot of problems and obstacles for the students, almost as if they're learning a new approach to their learning each year if the teachers do not communicate with each other or the school doesn't establish something for the entire school to have for EL. And then another part of teachers is this lack of teacher preparation, which we saw again and again in the research, but this paper really focused on that they just didn't quite understand the best practices for teaching EL, and that this is something that is really important when you have an English learner in your classroom, is really knowing how to help them and not just relying on kind of the typical teaching practices, but there really are additional things that you need to be doing with your EL student. So just to wrap up, when we look at these obstacles within the lens of the Triquetra, we can really see how these barriers are not isolated, right? It's not just something that the student faces, it's not just something that the caregivers or the teachers face alone, but that they are all connected. And although one may be focused on one part of the Triquetra than the other, they are all related and therefore obstacles that we all face together.
Despite the many challenges and shortcomings that emergent bilinguals may view themselves seeing in the classroom and in their personal lives, we can help reverse that course by having them adapt a positive academic mindset. And this will help students' overall mental health and academic performance as well. So EBs who view their situation as an asset rather than a deficit tend to have higher overall academic achievement. However, students must learn to gain this. This is not given. They're not born with this mentality. They need to learn it. And that comes through the teacher. That comes through us as well as their parents. So there are three main characteristics: teacher warmth and supportiveness, level of control the student feels over the content, and the student's grit level. And we'll talk about grit in a second. So what is grit? Grit is defined as perseverance and passion for long-term goals. So this is a focus on long-term goals as opposed to the short-term goals. And the Bond study that we look at studies the effect grit has on emergent bilinguals and non-emergent bilinguals when coupled with a supportive classroom environment and classroom control or content control from the student's perspective. So grit versus talent. Those who see their academic ability as a talent tend to get themselves at a level of a proficiency, and then they stop. Grit pushes us past that barrier. Grit pushes students past that level of proficiency into a much deeper level of knowledge and thinking. So it focuses on the students' strengths. So in order to build grit, we need, as teachers, need to discuss their strengths and how they can overcome a challenge using those strengths, as opposed to identifying weaknesses that they have, and making them a reason why they can't succeed. So when we do this, students have a more positive attitude towards academic challenges, and this lowers the barrier to success for those emergent bilinguals. So the study we looked at, it was a three-way interaction among emergent bilingual status, grit, care, or control. So it measured the level of care or control in the classroom through a response, a self-response survey that students completed. In total, 44% of the 3,272 subjects did identify as emergent bilinguals, and it was pretty split, 50% male, 50% female. So perceived care results. As you can see in the graph, those emergent bilinguals who had the highest level of grit and had the highest level of perceived care ended up testing just as well as their non-emergent bilingual peers, the native speaking peers. So when we coupled grit and care, the success factor was about the same for those two students. When perceived control, when the students thought that they had more control over the content, over what they were learning, that story was the same. As you can see in the graph here, when they are in a high perceived control environment, and coupled with the highest level of grit, the academic performance was relative the same to their native speaking partners. So this is in the ELA category. In math, the results were not as significant, but they still showed a positive relationship. So takeaways. Grit is a mindset that pushes students to persevere and embrace challenges inside and out of the classroom. And when we couple that with care in the classroom and student control, emergent bilingual students are most likely to view their situation as an asset rather than a deficit, thus creating a better academic performance out of those students.
Now, Brent just mentioned that grit can be an important mindset intervention to encourage students to see their situation as an asset rather than a deficit. These terms, asset and deficit, can also be used to refer to the mindset of the school community at large, which of course has an important impact on our Triquetra of relationships that we've discussed. Now, in the traditional model of approaching ELs and just in school communities in general, we operate on a deficit-oriented model. This means that we see caregivers in an EL family as lacking something. They have a deficit of proper English instruction. They have a deficit of what we have considered to be the assets of success in a traditional model. On the other side, teachers are the experts who need to instruct caregivers in the accepted techniques. We've been through teacher training, we're educated, and we see that as having something that puts us in a situation above the caregivers. In this traditional model of engagement, you can imagine this is not very positive in terms of how the caregivers and students view themselves. And in this model, caregivers have a passive role within the educational system. We are the distributors of knowledge, and the caregivers and the students passively receive. So think about the classic parent-teacher conferences, committees, etc. Yes, the caregivers are participating, but only on our terms, the school's terms, only at the school's invitation. You can also imagine different programs that the schools might try to intervene on the caregivers to almost control how they instruct their children at home. So you can think about reading intervention programs where the caregivers are instructed to read certain books to their children without taking into account the caregiver's own opinions, certain cultural values that they might want to instill on their own, or just their own philosophies about education. And so you can imagine this model of prescribing certain ways or curriculum on the caregivers is quite similar to what teachers face in our everyday classroom. And so as we as teachers have learned, the best way for teachers to teach is to trust the teachers and let them do what they do best. And so the same applies to caregivers. That brings us to an alternative model engagement, seeing the caregivers in an asset-oriented model that trusts them, respects their judgment, and empowers them to educate their children alongside of the teachers. In such a model, this can have positive effects on the caregivers and students, of course, because it empowers them. But from a teacher's perspective, this can help teachers understand the ways their students work and think. This encourages students to explore multiple means of representation. The same reason why we value diversity in the classroom. Diversity of families and EL assets can bring different ways of teaching we might have never thought about. And finally, this enables better collaboration and communication with EL families when they feel that their opinion is being valued and appreciated and is actually being taken into account. This encourages families to communicate with their teacher. So there have been several studies where alternative engagement programs have actually been conducted. And in this model, caregivers and students report feeling confident, enthusiastic about the coursework, and they had a better relationship with the teacher. Now, what are some examples of what an asset-oriented model might look like in a school? What we're trying to do is create room for caregivers to work with the students and teachers instead of assisting them on the teacher's own mission. So in one model, caregivers taught alongside the teachers at after-school math workshops. You can also see different strengths that EL households might present, unique assets that can bring to the classroom a benefit above and beyond perhaps a traditional all English speaking only classrooms. So for example, one study looked at STEM classrooms and they found Hispanic students may value collaborative scientific progress rather than an independent, individualistic working style. And you can imagine the world of science where it requires lab groups and collaboration against different scientific groups. This is such a positive mindset to have in the classroom. Another study saw that the linguistic argumentative patterns of Creole-speaking Haitians, so the way that Creoles argued, mirrored the way that scientists argue in a scientific journal. So by building on the language patterns of the first language that the students already speak, they might actually have an advantage in a science classroom over an English-speaking student. That's a great way to celebrate a student's bilingualism and bring the assets of their language into the classroom.
All right, so now we're going to get into some of the more practical pedagogical practices that you as the teacher can incorporate in your classroom. As the teacher, in this intersectional relationship between the EL student, the caregiver, and the teacher, it's important in that role to understand that at this point, it's more of an opportunity gap for these English learners rather than it is an achievement gap when you take a look at the insufficient job we've done in terms of meeting their needs. And understand that critical literacy, which is basically what a student or individual can do with a text or knowledge of the language in terms of their own production, does not indicate fluency. So I'll get into that a little bit more, but there are difficulties that our students are facing as English learners that we need to take into account. And the first one is understanding that the students are learning academic language at the same time that the language content or the content is being taught. This is not necessarily what good teaching is supposed to be, because English learners need further support with grammatical and phonological aspects of the language, and knowing that just interaction or exposure to it through osmosis is not sufficient. But incorporating physical movement, multiple modes of expression and instruction is extremely important, because learning a second language and the memory connection to a physical movement or a visual image, anything interactive is extremely necessary, because it can't all just be learned from speaking or listening. So I have here I+1, and we're going to take a look at that in terms of comprehensible input, which deals with the zone of proximal development. And the I is a student's current ability. The +1 is the ability that we want them to get to, essentially getting a little bit further from what they know, but having the student access this stretch by using their prior knowledge to get to that point. And we need relevant context to do that. We need to provide background knowledge and contextual info to our English learners. And visual aids and physical artifacts, as I briefly mentioned, are extremely important in terms of gestures, images, pictures, whatever it may be. But we also need to connect to our students' prior knowledge and experiences, because understanding the dynamics of why a student is in our classroom, how they got to be here. Not all English learners are the same just because they may speak the same language. So knowing that and reaching out to them, the content matter and being in class becomes more meaningful, and their motivation is raised as a result. In terms of methods, it's important to understand that assessment should not just be okay, you don't need to worry about this since you don't understand it. It needs to be tracking learning and their progress in multiple modes over time. So differentiating by the same note should not be detracting from the expectations. Differentiating for English learners needs to build on student strength and interest, as well as the feedback from these assessments need to be showing what the learners can do and scaffolding towards further growth. And finally, in terms of supports in the classroom, I've listed some of these, particularly in regard to visual aids, but one I'm going to touch on very briefly is peer collaboration and the importance of cooperative learning, because communication is in an input and an output when you pair students together. So English learners have access to or practice with both aspects of their language production, and they're given the chance to express ideas and thoughts through this social collaboration. And the visual aids can be something as simple as a gesture or a picture or an image, but it can also be as complex as analyzing artwork that's applicable to literature or anything that you're discussing in a humanities class. So that's widely applicable, and it goes a little bit deeper than just pairing vocabulary with imagery, but pairing vocabulary with imagery is also important in the process of transferring what you know with an image, and that association with the word goes a long way. And in terms of transfer, the use of native language is necessary at times, and it's also very important to go over cognates and prepare supports that allow them to access their knowledge of their own language or their native language, and how that can assist them in their understanding of English. So, above all things, the feedback, our assessments need to be structured to help students showcase what they can do with what they know how to do, and this attitude will help propel students forward, and hopefully teachers by the same token will also begin to gain an appreciation for the asset and the superpower that is bilingualism.